Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on sacred, the natural, and religion, and also on entheogens, which would be plant substances that enable an experience of something greater, specifically the divine. So I call this the explosive sacred. Let's get right into it. So Stefan Beyer, who we're going to meet a little bit later, has this wonderful quote that leads off our chapter in Kripal. I think the plants love us. I have no idea why. We certainly have done nothing, at least recently, to deserve it. I think that they want us to be human beings again. This is from his very important work from 2009 called Singing to the Plants. And here, Stefan Beyer is really trying to connect this notion of the plant world, the human world, the religious world, and the relationality between man and nature and the divine, and in fact that nature is divine. So first off, what is the sacred? Now I've used this word quite a bit. The sacred means to set something apart. The sacred is a religious experience. This is different from something that's immediately apparent. So the world as different from how we usually see it. An explosion of the sacred is a revelation of that thing that is beyond us. We have a notion of the sacred being different from the secular. The secular is sort of the religious. So usually the sacred is considered something that's a religious. Think of a sacred text, sacred writings, sacred music. These are different than sort of the mundane style of music or sacred. So traditionally and in our connotations of the world, when we say the sacred in our Western culture, we mean Christianity. And in Christianity, the sacred is something other than secular. But my question is, what about people who aren't Christians? What about these modern people who are spiritual but not religious? Maybe the sacred isn't necessarily limited to sanctioned religion. For instance, when we cut up an animal in sacrifice, in any culture, it's different from the work of just a butcher who's cutting that animal up for in order to create food. The sacred is not just something that is a past experience by a holy person. I think especially if we're raised as Protestant Christians, we have this idea, and this comes from Protestant dispensationalism, that says that miracles and visions don't happen anymore. Those are for the time of Christ, and immediately after Christ, we're in a different time frame where that doesn't happen anymore. But in fact, people continue to have experiences of the sacred in various ways. So Moses goes onto the mountaintop, has a sacred experience, perhaps one of the most powerful sacred experiences, when he sees God, and he comes down. And I had this rabbi that said, Moses went up onto the hill, something happened, he came back down and said, okay, I won't eat ham. And that was the beginning of the covenant with the Israelites. So Moses has a sacred experience, comes down off the mountain, sets up the 10 Commandments. Now the question is, can the sacred and can an experience like this happen to contemporary people? The writings of the Vedas, remember when we looked at Vedic religion recently, are said to be apaurushaya. They are not authored by anyone, not by man, not by God, but the rishis, or those seers, are able to tune in and experience them and make them into texts. That is another experience of the sacred. But maybe there's more to it. Maybe the sacred can be cultivated. Maybe the sacred can be created. Maybe the sacred as this feeling of holiness or reverence is something that is accessible to people at all times. Now, the sacred is usually considered to be an experience of the superhuman world and having that immediately around us. It's sublime. It's beyond our immediate experience. But there are some other ways we can think about the sacred. One particular author named Michael Tausig, whom I quite like, says that desecration causes the sacred, causes a creation of the sacred. So you can walk by, let's say, a monument or a statue every day. You don't think anything of it. You walk by it one day and somebody cut the head off of it. Whoa, you're thinking about it now. That statue that just didn't matter at all is suddenly sacred. Now, these days in the United States, we have some experiences of that. We had, especially in this 2020 season, we've had a great awakening in which people have been pulling down Civil War monuments. Now, these Civil War monuments, some people are glorious remnants in our history itself. Other people say, oh, those are just bronze or stone items. Other people argue that they were actually erected during the Jim Crow era, not to commemorate any type of heroic Southern glory, but to, in fact, put terror into the hearts of Black folk and people of color that see them and remind them that the South will rise again. Incidentally, when we look to the history of lynchings, when we map them onto the United States, we can see that these Civil War monuments, especially those reenacted or those that are built in the mid-20th century, can be found in a more condensed area as where there are lynchings. But that's regardless. The bigger thing is the fact that when somebody pulls down or desecrates or puts graffiti on those monuments, suddenly everybody's looking at them. Now, white folk might have been walking by them all the time and not noticing. Black folk definitely do notice these Civil War monuments. So when we pull down or desecrate something like that, suddenly we have this eruption of the sacred that has been in the news cycle of people saying, how can you destroy history? So suddenly these things that were sort of ignored become sacred. You can see an American flag or any flag all the time. The minute somebody burns it, suddenly people are like, whoa, the flag, it's a big deal. So by breaking things, by desecrating things, we actually create the experience of the sacred, an experience of reverence. So there are other ongoing ideas of the sacred other than by desecration, as I said. With the sacred, we're thinking about individual mystic moments when we commune with something greater. What about near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, or even the psychedelic experience or the experience of aliens? Once upon a time, people have had these types of experiences and said, oh, I'm communing with angels, I'm communing with God. But maybe now they're communing with creatures from another dimension. Maybe they're having an experience of going to other worlds. So we have an ongoing idea of the sacred. And I want to think for a minute about, can the sacred be revealed through taking a drug, through taking a substance or an entheogen? If it can, then these natural substances, are they revealers also of a natural sacred world? Is nature revealing itself in that substance? Does consuming nature to experience nature mean we have a different understanding of the natural world? And what is the relationship between the sacred and the natural world, by which I mean this sort of embodied eco-body of nature? Can the sacred also be experienced in the human created world, not necessarily the sacred? In other words, if I'm having a profound sacred experience or profound experience of the divine or something more than human, and I see that through looking at, say, a piece of art or even a building, is that still the sacred? Is the sacred always connected to the natural world? So one caveat, we're going to be talking about drugs, but this is not a place for drug talk. On the discussion forums, on in your writing, I don't want to hear about your drug experiences. Do not write about your drug experiences for this class. You can write about the experiences of the sacred and whatnot, but we need to remember that a lot of the substances and these experiences that we're going to be described might be considered sacred, and they may have been considered sacred for a long time. But since the 1950s, the United States has sort of bullied the illegality of these substances worldwide, and I do not endorse the use of any of these illicit or illegal substances. One thing I would like to note, though, is marijuana was perfectly legal for all time in India, but here's one example. In Nepal during the early 1970s, Richard Nixon withheld a very specific funding package telling the king of Nepal at the time that he would only pass it if he made marijuana illegal, because Nixon had seen a whole bunch of Americans going over to Nepal and getting turned on to various drug substances, and he didn't like that. So since that time in Nepal, marijuana is illegal, and it's due to the mucking about of the American government. So moving forth, we have this word called the hierophany. Hieros from the Greek means the sacred or the holy or even the religious, and phani means the appearance. So hierophany is the appearance or manifestation of the holy. We also have this word called the hierophant, which makes me always think of these two tarot cards. Both are the hierophant. One is in the Thoth deck, and the other is from the classic Marseille deck. So a hierophant is someone who is an expounder of sacred mysteries, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, or religious ceremonies, an initiating or presiding priest, a minister of revelation, or an interpreter of any esoteric principle. Now we have a character who we're going to meet again named Mircea Eliade, who was very much the founder, in many ways, of religious studies. He was at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School. Now, Eliade argues that the hierophany is an experience of the sacred that is mediated by the natural world. So Eliade wrote about this extensively, about how one could experience, you would see a particular, okay, here's one of his classic hierophanies. He says that there is a stone, and that stone looks like a skull. That's the place Golgotha. That stone is at the foot of the cross where Christ is crucified. Now, that place that looks like a skull is in fact a skull, and is the skull of Adam. Thereby, the skull linked with Christ on the cross shows the redemption of man and God through Christ. That's what he calls a hierophany. But he would also say that at any point that, say, a shaman goes into the woods and he experiences the flight of a bird in which he understands the truth of the spirit within that bird, that is also a hierophany. So anytime the experience of the sacred and of the superhuman happens when one is observing the world, that would be a hierophany, a revelation of the sacred, an explosion of the sacred, if you will. So what are one of the main ways that we structure the world? We structure the world in purity codes. Now, there's a scholar named Mary Douglas who really established this really well, and I'm going to be borrowing a lot from her work here. And what I'm asking here is, how do we use the notion of pure and impure to order the world? We're going to go back on this to talk about an entheogen and a drug. Remember, drugs are bad. Entheogen? Well, in our culture, it's not too clear these days, but an entheogen is a better word than a drug. Okay, the natural world is in fact unmediated and unstructured. We place culture upon the natural world in order to make sense of our own individual place in the world, and of our specific culture's place, of our in-group, of our religion, of our group of insiders. Folks argue that dietary codes are in fact reasonable and pragmatic, such as you shouldn't eat pork because of the dangers of trichinosis, arguing that that's why Jews stopped eating pork, or Hebrews stopped eating pork at a certain point. But in fact, the Hebrews were surrounded by a bunch of people who all ate quite a bit of pork at the time and were just fine, were perfectly healthy. So they hated and they wanted to separate from, the Hebrews wanted to separate from the Canaanites and the Philistines. So they denied eating pork to set themselves apart from their rivals who were in a vast pork-eating zone, if you will. Actually, a vast pork-eating zone sounds delicious. All right, so they denied pork to set themselves apart. So having a culture requires you to delineate between the members and the non-members. So we label the non-members or the outsiders impure, and we label ourselves pure. Now, think about how we talk about immigrants these days and how they are sort of a contagion into our culture. So they are the outsiders who have come in and they have brought impurity to our culture. Think about how we label insiders in a specific way. Food regulation is common to separate people worldwide. Remember when we read about the Vedic priests in training, they were all very strict vegetarians. Now, Brahmins, for the most part in India, are vegetarian. That's how they separate themselves out from other people, because they don't eat meat. So what we eat dictates who we are and who we aren't. Recently, think about the sort of rabid sort of anger that people have around COVID-19 about the Chinese diet, saying that the Chinese eat terrible foods, which brought the virus of COVID-19 to us, even though we scientifically know that that is not the case by any means. If you listen, people will always say that it is impurity that is brought on by poor diets or poor sexual practices. In fact, during the times of the Great AIDS crisis, which was a horrific time, many people would say, oh, somebody got this by having sex with a monkey. And then they transmitted it to gay folk who transmitted it to the rest of the world. When in reality, I was talking to an epidemiologist in India one time. He said, oh yeah, it comes from bushmeat and monkey meat, but this is how it happens. What you do is you're cutting up bushmeat and blood's getting all over the place because you're doing it with a knife on a big block of wood, and you cut your finger and the blood gets into there, and that's likely how AIDS got into the human body, and then it transmitted to the world. But once again, that story of somebody had sex with a monkey, which leads to us, and that person was impure doing an impure thing, and they brought that impurity, that contagion into our culture, and it kills our people. Of course, it's always someone other. Impurity comes from the other and is brought into our world. We regulate substances more than food, such as sex, as I just said, but we also talk about illegal and illicit substances. And you got to think, well, what drugs are legal and what drugs are illegal? Well, alcohol is legal after you're 21. Marijuana is, for the most part, accepted these days, though it was originally made illegal because it was considered to be associated with black folk. Think about the drugs that people talk about that are really bad. Like you have people that smoke crack versus people that do cocaine. Now, both are considered illegal, but if you look at the sentencing structure in the United States, crack gets 20 years, cocaine gets 3. Well, maybe there's a reason for that, and that crack is associated with colored people. Furthermore, think about the way people talk about the the vicious illicit drug dealer versus the hippie that just wants to sell a little pot. Also, to take that even further, think about the way we talk about methamphetamine versus the way we talk about marijuana. So, but what am I getting at? I'm getting at a notion of dirt. What is dirt? Well, dirt is chaos. Now, in the garden, dirt's great. In the kitchen, dirt is wrong. J.Z. Smith, one of my favorite thinkers, we read one of his definitions of religion in Jeffrey Kripal, talked about when he was young, he worked on a farm. And the farmer he worked with would wash immaculately every morning, put on his work clothes, went out, have breakfast, and then immediately when he walked out of the house, he would reach down and grab a handful of dirt and rub it on his hands, and he was there to go. Now, you wouldn't rub dirt on your hands in the house. You rub dirt on your hands as you go out into the garden, and then you're able to interact more with that world around you. So another story a friend of mine told me is she moved in with this kind of hippie guy that wanted to go roll around to follow some jam band, and he needed some money to do it. So he was going to make up some burritos. And he was like, well, how am I going to make these burritos? And she was like, all right, you degenerate man, let's see what you do. So he got a trash can, and he mixed up all the substances in a trash can, and then he folded it into tortillas, and she's like, why? And he was like, look, it's no different from a pot. We don't have a pot. We've got this trash can. I cleaned it really well. And she said she thought to herself, why is this different? If it is a clean pot versus a clean trash can, what's the difference? And she said that it was dirt out of place. The trash can is coated with filth and waste, so to prepare food in it makes that food contaminated. So you see this notion of boundaries and purity and impurity kind of work in a lot of different ways. Now, an addendum to this is Mary Douglas established an idea called holy dirt. Holy men are often quite filthy. Spend some time with some sadhus in India. They're pretty dirty. They sort of revel in dirt. They cultivate a dirtiness. When you read about holy men in antiquity, in these saints, they were often very dirty as well. But in that, whereas a normal person would be clean, they can be dirty and still be sacred and holy because they have power over that dirt and over that impurity. Their holiness overwhelms their contact with dirt. In this way, when we're going to talk about some sort of sacred drug experiences that today involve taking substances that are considered dirty by society. LSD was continually talked about as leading toward madness and destroying your brain and causing people to commit suicide. But yet Steve Jobs, we talk about now, as having an LSD experience that allowed him to create the iPod. So our notion of what is a drug that is bad versus what is a drug that is good has changed, and it's more than just legal and illegal. Finally, which drugs do we consider illegal? Well, we consider marijuana to be illegal because it's inherently bad. I live in Colorado, it's legal here. So it once was illegal, now it's legal. Marijuana is regularly used in the Indian culture. In fact, on the night of Shivaratri, the sacred night to Shiva, every Hindu around, man, woman, and child, it's completely stoned out of their mind to commune with the god Shiva, who is associated with marijuana and with ganja. So if other cultures don't consider these to be inherently bad, then they are not inherently bad. We consider it bad, they don't consider it bad. So is it inherently bad? No, it's just what thinking makes it so. There is no good nor bad, but what thinking makes it so. So we're moving forward here to think about a new heaven, a new earth, and the new sacred. Traditionally, when we understand the sacred, it is a light that comes out of the sky. It is God that lives in the sky, but maybe the sacred can be more than that. Remember that before our contemporary understanding of the world and the earth as being this beautiful blue marble that's floating through space, we have the Hebrew cosmology, in which you will see it depicted here, which I think is pretty great. And you have the heavens, or the firmament, which is above us, and above that are great waters. And above those waters are the heavens and gods. Hanging below those, that firmament, that space between the sky and the heavens, were thought to be windows or floodgates. And when those windows open, rain would fall down. Below there is the stars and the sky. And then you have the earth. Under the earth is the underworld. And then all of that floats upon oceans all around and a great abyss beneath. So this is the natural world according to the Hebrew scripture. Further, that didn't last completely because people incorporated a lot of astronomical discussion, started to think about there being a multiple of spheres, in fact, 7 spheres that one could mystically move through meditation, or that Muhammad went through, peace be upon him, as he ascended unto heaven in a time called the Miraj. Well, we've experienced space, the final frontier. The human experience of space means that all of these cosmological myths can't be true. Now that we see space and the earth floating through space, we can't believe in the firmament and the heavens and the rain that comes through the windows. It doesn't mean they lack meaning, because these myths, even if they're proven to not be scientifically valid, they still have meaning for us. They still allow us to structure the world and understand the world. Now, Edgar Mitchell, who was an astronaut meaning star traveler, described seeing the whole world as he looked at the earth, and he saw it all together as a single organism with a unified consciousness. He even described this experience as samadhi. In yoga, samadhi means, because it's savikalpa samadhi. So samadhi means the complete union, but it means a complete understanding of man, God, and the universe all at once. He called it savikalpa, so that means with thoughts. There's another one called nirvikalpa or avikalpa samadhi, which means there are no thoughts. It's a complete emptiness. So he described his experience of the whole world as one using this Indic notion of yoga and union. He went on to form the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is a research institute to facilitate the study of consciousness and the paranormal, seeking to study direct experiences of samadhi, like he said. Noetic comes from a Greek meaning pure intellect or transcendental thought. So the earth, nature, and the eco-body. Now, we're moving forward into sort of a more theological realm. So there's this notion of deep ecology or deep green religion as a religious movement worldwide. Now, it has a lot of connections with neo-paganism or sort of neo-animism. What do I mean by neo-paganism? I mean groups like the Wiccans, the Druids, people who have a new understanding of what they say to be this old craft of witchcraft that involves communion with nature. Now, neo-paganism is also somewhat connected to what we have in the theological world that we call eco-theology. Now, in eco-theology, the entire eco-body, all of the green of the world and all of the people and all of the earth, the whole eco-body is thought to be sacred. This eco-body creates humans, and humans have a deep connection to this deep green world. This overlaps with animism. You remember, animism is the idea that the world is filled with souls everywhere, especially the natural world, or the world itself has a soul that we can interact with. Now here, nature is not thought to be a thing to be consumed, but we are to have a relationship with nature because it is our creator and our maintainer. There is no human moral superiority. In the Hebrew Bible, man is created and thought to be a steward of the earth. Adam is given the task of naming, thereby, some would argue, creating all the animals. In this deep green theology, the world has created us. We do not have dominion over it. If anything, it has dominion over us. We're not even stewards or caretakers of the earth. In fact, eco-religion says taking care of nature and communing with nature and seeing nature as sacred is in fact self-defense, because without nature we will be utterly demolished on this earth. So nature is the source of religion itself. Religion is not handed down by a god. Nature is religion. Religion is not from God. Nature is religion. Now, that said, there are some critiques of this. Some theologians have argued that the monotheistic notion that God gave man dominion over the earth is the root of our eco-crisis. I would merely point them to polytheistic traditions in China and India and their terrible ecological crises. I would say that the bigger problem, in fact, with our understandings of the world is that we believe there is a heaven beyond this space. If you believe that there is no heaven to go to, that this is the only life, or you're going to be reborn in this very life, not any other, over and over and over again, you're called to take care of the earth instead of believing that, screw the earth, I'm going to live in heaven eternally anyway. There are problems with eco-religion, namely there's eco-terrorism, people who want to kill other people to protect trees. That's problematic. Also, it's been argued that this sort of deep green religion can trample easily on individual and even group rights when you take the ecosystem to be greater than humanity. So what about creationism, evolution, nature, and intelligent design? So we have here what Seinfeld calls the Jesus fish, the ichthus. I don't have an orthodox one because I like these two. So one, you have the fish, it says Darwin in the center instead of Christ at the center. But in this, let's take it a step further. And it shows that we have all of nature and that it is sort of divine and that Darwin shows the shape of it. Furthermore, we have evolve over here. We have the other fish that has grown legs and started using tools. Now, I would argue that there's actually a more sophisticated notion of these than just an anti-Christianity, but it posits that maybe creation is dictated by evolution, dictated by Darwinism and evolutionary processes, but who's to say that those aren't divine in the first place? So contemporary fundamentalist, literalist understandings of the Christian Bible says, or they deny the established scientific facts of Darwinism and the evolutionary process. So they would argue that either God literally created the world in 6 days and the earth is, 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and that is literally what happened, or all of it is bullshit. I don't buy this. I've never bought this. I mean, I grew up thinking this, that God had to create the world literally in the way that it's written in the Hebrew Bible as it's translated into English on 6 days, and then he took a rest. Well, maybe there's more to it than that. Now, evolutionary theorists generally do say that evolution is random. It's a process of mutation and selection. So there'll be a creature that has a small, minute variation that allows it to breed more, and thereby it develops over successive generations in which that which has a successful mutation is able to breed more. That causes natural selection. But who's to say that there isn't a sort of genius to that there isn't a sort of spirit behind it? Now, you don't have to make the choice of either the world is completely random or you believe in the literal description of the world evolving, or of the world not evolving, but being created exactly as it is according to God, which does give you the problem of what about dinosaurs, what about the fossil record? Well, maybe we can have intelligent design. So what is intelligent design? Many scientists will argue that the evolutionary process is merely a random work of mutation and selection. Others, like say Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, see certain structures behind evolution. Is there a genius or a guiding consciousness behind evolution? Could that genius be God, or could that in fact be a consciousness, a part of which we share in, but that is found suffusing all of the world? So intelligent design can mean two things. One, people will say, God did it and is behind everything that happens, literally. So when somebody says, I believe in intelligence design, they can mean that, they can just mean creationism. Or you can mean that there is a trajectory of evolution in the natural world and in the human world, and that is all guided by God. Intriguingly, Hindus don't have a problem with Darwinism at all. They go, oh yeah, that's how it works. God created the world, sure, and gods come and go, and things evolve, and yeah, there you go. They'll even look at the different incarnations of Vishnu through whether he's Krishna, Rama, the fish, the boar, all these many incarnations. And they said that, oh yeah, that's the evolutionary process. Buddhists will even look at the history of the Buddha's past lives. They're all recorded in narratives and say that those show the creation of humanity from animals and that the Buddha was being reborn all along that way in various manners. I am particularly fond of a specific Protestant minister, and I can't remember his name, in Nashville. And I would go to church at the time. I was dating this fundamentalist woman who was charming. But, you know, I was me, being me and having a lot of questions. But the minister had this really great idea. He would put up a PowerPoint presentation. It's a picture of the earth. And he'd say, God created the world. How do you do it? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. God did it. That's it. He'd say, was it 6 days? Was it 6 billion years? I don't care. It doesn't matter. You don't need to care. If you get stuck on this idea, he would argue about God creating the world literally in 6 days and human beings only being 6,000 years old. He said, you're just confusing yourself. God did it. That's it. Move on. What's important is you have a relationship with God and you submit to God and you realize that God is your creator. How he did it doesn't matter. Think about all of the arguments that people have over a literal interpretation of the Bible, whether God created the earth in 6 days and on the seventh day he rested and mankind is 7,000 years old, or just this simple, elegant argument. God did it. How did he do it? Doesn't matter. You can look to science for that if you want, or you can believe that it's literal. It doesn't matter. The important point is God did it. That's it. I find this elegant. Okay, so let's get a little bit further into this explosion of the sacred. We're going to go beyond our sort of Christian, monotheistic, and Western notions here. What is shamanism? So the explosion of the sacred, what is shamanism? So the word shaman is a Siberian word that means sorcerer. Now, a lot of our descriptions of shamanism these days come from a guy named Mircea Eliade. Remember him? He wrote a book in 1964, maybe it was 1962. Or he probably wrote it earlier. It took a while to get translated into English. I can't remember right now. Called The Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Truth be told, I read this book when I was 16. It's kind of amazing. It's a big, thick book in which Eliade combs through anthropological studies of what he calls shaman from around the world, and he argues that there are these patterns for shamanism. He, in fact, stresses techniques of ecstasy, and he specifically says that he's going to look at shamanism that leads towards soul flight, or the soul exiting the body. This connects with some of his other ideas about yoga and his interpretations of Christianity. He downplays substances. He makes a point of saying, I'm not even going to look at this. And I was writing in the 1960s by the time that many of these substances, from mescaline to peyote to upcoming of LSD, which was sort of invented in the 1940s, had been considered, for the most part, illegal or illicit. So when he's writing about shamanism, he almost wants to say, I'm not going to look at shamans doing any substances or consuming any substances because that would put me into the realm of working with drugs, which he didn't want to do. So he has this shamanic paradigm. Now, I wouldn't say that this inherently exists, but you see this pattern often. So, and I want you to think about, as I go through this real quickly, I want you to think about the hero's journey. First thing is a shaman has an initiatory calling that's usually accompanied by a near-death experience or a great illness. Coming out of this, there are visions, and the shaman becomes different from other people because he's had these visions of the divine, connections to the sacred spirit. Also, he experienced, usually, and this kind of crosses cultures, an initiatory experience where his body is ripped apart and put back together, but it now has magic within it. He's been transformed. Through that initiatory experience, he has a bodily transformation. So his body is remade in those experiences. He's able to manipulate trance through singing, dancing, drumming, or consuming sacred plants. This is done for the purpose of soul retrieval, in which he goes and finds a part of one's soul that is broken apart because of trauma, and he can get that part of your soul and bring it back. Or he can do healing, or he can fight demons, or he can kill illnesses by going into a trance and killing the illness-causing demon. They cause healing. They have healing powers, so they do these practices to heal others. They are keepers of mythical lore and symbolic knowledge. They're also practitioners of divination. Now, I have a little bit of a background with this. In my late teens, actually met a man, not this man, Michael Harner, but a man named Peter Richards, and he's a neo-shaman in Michigan. And I went to him and I took initiations and was trained to do trance meditation in the style of this Michael Harner style. My teacher and I had a little bit of a falling out when he said, when I asked him what's next, I would see him every couple of weeks and he would give me sort of assignments, and I would go and I would listen to this. I would either play a drum or I would listen to a recording of a drum, and I would go on these trance meditations. I had a lot of amazing experiences. I asked him at one point, what's next? And he said, you need to start healing people. You need to have your own practice of shamanism. And right about that time, I became interested in Hinduism. And I said, I'm done with you. So I have this background, and it's in this system of Michael Harner's system of neo-shamanism. What is neo-shamanism? It's non-native people doing sort of shamanic type stuff. Michael Harner was an anthropologist and an ethnobotanist who was studying the Amazon, and he actually took ayahuasca, which we're going to be talking about more in just a second. And he had an experience of a great boat, and he saw that come down, and he experienced all these creatures within that boat, and he had these powerful and really scary experiences. He went to one of the natives that he was working with at the time. They said, you just got initiated, buddy. And he continued working, and he learned from them these techniques, and they said to him, you need to take this to the West and take this to the world. So he came back to the United States, and he wrote this wonderful book, Way of the Shaman, and he taught practices of trance journey meditation, downplaying substances, even though he was like, a substance got me here. But he said, you can do this without these substances. He also said, this is a system that I learned about, but it's about me. This is my system. We're not taking this from indigenous cultures anyway. It's a system that was a bit revealed to me. I'm giving it to you. It's a system, you can use it. It's about trance meditation. It is not about becoming a part of any of these cultures that have sort of not necessarily influenced it, but have definitely influenced him. So that's sort of important in neo-shamanism. All right, so moving right along, the explosion of the sacred. Now, entheogens. These are substances that experience or that cause someone to cultivate or experience something of the divine. We're going to be looking specifically at ayahuasca, but we have two more stories to get to first. Our first story is about a guy named Grant Morrison, looking an awful lot like Professor Xavier here. He was a musician, he is a musician, an artist, a writer, and he's also considers himself a chaos magician. I'll talk about chaos magic at some point later. He actually describes having this incredible experience in Kathmandu in the early 90s. He was already a pretty successful comic book artist. He'd done a good run on Batman and the comic book The Invisibles. So he goes to visit this Buddhist tantric temple, and when he comes back, he's writing in his journal, and he smokes a little bit of hash. He says a lentil-sized bit of hash. Having lived in Kathmandu and been around a fair bit of hash, that's not very much. And he said he was a little stoned. But suddenly the buildings around rose up and sort of came to life around him, and everything worked and moved. So he goes down into his hotel room, terrified, and it continues. And he says these undulating, endless, like liquid metal creatures came toward him. And in fact, he says to them, what's up? And they're like, well, you call us, let's go. Where do you want to go? And he's like, I don't know, the fifth dimension. So they take him to the fifth dimension. And he goes into this other world, and he says he saw a realm of single weird anemone-like megahydras with its single-celled immortal root in the Precambrian tides and its billions of sensory branches from ferns to people. I got a video for you to watch. This guy is very strange, very cool, very weird, has an odd way of speaking. He has an experience of an infant god, a baby fetal god attached to a placental support system called the Earth. From this, he sees all of reality as consciousness. He posited that beings in the fifth dimension may be dreaming us. Upon returning for a while, he said he could see human beings in a new way. It's like he could see them all connected to everything. When you look at the barista, he would see her as a 15 million armed deity. Now, having a little experience with meditation myself, and remember, that's long after the experience. He said he had this for several weeks. I know that when I've had some really powerful meditative experiences, I remember at one point I was sitting in a class in college, and I'd just done a long meditation session, and I had to get out of the class. I had to leave the class. And I walked outside, and I was looking at rain coming through leaves on a tree, and I was seeing the crystal, sort of like crystal-like light of the raindrops. And as I saw that, I was able to see every tree and every raindrop all at once, and I was able to see the light coming through all of them, and I felt myself just completely disappear. And all there was just shimmering light throughout. These are experiences that people have. They're natural. You don't need drugs. You don't even need meditation. These are natural. We're wired for this. We as human beings are God makers. We are mystics, all of us. We can all have these experiences, and we think of them as extraordinary because we grow up thinking, you know, there was Jesus, there was people that had visions of angels. Nobody does that anymore. No, you can still have them. They're perfectly normal. They're what our brains are meant to do. So he eventually says, and I quite like this quote, this is from his autobiography called Super Gods, the universe, the entire space-time continuum, from Big Bang to heat death, no less, was not a linear system of events with beginning, middle, and end. That was only how it felt from the inside. In fact, the totality of existence looked more like a ball of sphincters, constantly moving through itself in a way that was hypnotic and awe-inspiring to observe. There was Shakespeare scribbling King Lear on one wrinkled fold of those. And just around the corner from him, forever out of his line of sight, was a Cretaceous period and Tyrannosauruses paddling past his wife Anne Hathaway's cottage. Boom! Everything all at once. What's Morrison getting at? Everything, everywhere, always, all at once, he was saying. The intriguing thing about Morrison is he was like, well, you know, maybe this is drug. Maybe this was because I was high. Well, maybe it wasn't. He said he spent like the next 10 years taking every drug he could, trying to recreate this experience in Kathmandu, and he couldn't do it. And that's when he realized this was a powerful mystical experience that wasn't the result of drugs in any way. Morrison goes on to argue that superhero stories are our own collective mythology. He even argues that we think about superheroes to connect to our highest ideals. In one of his mystic experiences, he saw that there were superhero-like creatures that have created and observe our world. Our superhero stories are hierophany. We try to be superheroes and because they are the best of us, and that in fact, he would argue that they even create us. He writes about encounters in which he created in the past. He created a character. And the next thing he knew, he met that person in real life. So if he could write a person in a comic book and then meet that person in real life, maybe there is a world where they are writing about us, that we are being experienced by those superhero authors that are writing and thinking about and imagining our own world. High weirdness. Jeffrey Kripal, our author, has written about an experience that he just calls That Night. I'll talk about it very briefly here. Kripal was doing his field work, and this would have been in the late 80s, early 90s. He was in Calcutta, and he had this experience one night in which he saw the goddess above him as he was laying in bed. He saw the goddess Kali. Now, he had been attending many worship rituals to her that day. His body vibrated electrically. And he said that his whole world changed. He felt complete connection to the whole world and a revelation of totality. He's also said he's never had this experience again. Now, intriguingly, Kripal says that all of his books and all of his thought that have happened even recently were born out of that night. It was as if all of his books were beamed into him by that experience, by that goddess, by whatever that goddess was representing. And it's all unfolding now. Morrison has said the same thing about all of his comic books. He said everything he's thought has come out of that night, not just as an experience and reaction to that night, but he feels that the entire totality of his work was beamed into him and it's steadily evolving in his head. Finally, we have Stephen Beyer. Now, this is going to be explicitly the discussion of using a drug. Whereas Kripal was totally sober and Morrison was just a hint stone and managed to get really high on everything he could later and couldn't reproduce this experience. Beyer is specifically talking about experiences with a specific substance called ayahuasca. Now, who is Stephen Beyer? He is an anthropologist, not unlike Michael Harner, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Cult of Tara, magic and ritual in Tibet about his fieldwork in Ladakh in the 70s. Now, I even have a couple of teachers who studied with him a little bit at Berkeley and said it was this incredible professor. He was like, I'm out. So he left the academy and went and got his PhD in psychology, and he even got a Juris Doctorate. So he's a doctor, lawyer, and he does work in social justice. It's fascinating work to read about. Anyway, so he continued to do his own research as an anthropologist, and he went to Central America, to Ecuador, I believe, and he started practicing with and studying with people who do rituals around ayahuasca, this psychotropic substance. Now, ayahuasca is a particular type of plant. So in its leaves, it has the active ingredient of DMT. I can't remember the full term, which is very potent hallucinogen. But if you just consume the leaves of the plant, the human body has an enzyme which will digest it and it'll have no effects. However, the people of the time realized that if you take another plant, you take the vines from this other plant and you stack the leaves and the vines together and boil them for many hours, you can create this substance called ayahuasca. Now, the vine has a chemical in it that inhibits the enzyme that digests the DMT in the leaves. So combining these two elements, when consumed in the human body, will create a psychotropic experience, or psychedelic, that which reveals the psyche, which means mind or soul, or revelation or creation of the soul. When people are asked, how the heck did you figure out how to do this? The shaman and medicine men of the place just say, oh, the plants told us. The plant told us how to do this. So ayahuasca's potent DMT has been extracted synthetically so that you can smoke it or inject it. That creates an intense 15-minute trip. I do not endorse this experience in any way. All right, so when Beyer describes this experience, he describes what happens, or hold on. When people do these ayahuasca practices, the shaman prepares the substance, then does ritual purification of the substance, ritual purification of the people, ritually purifies the participants, then gives it to them and continues doing rituals. Then there's a ritual around the experience, and then the end of the experience and the interpretation of the experience. All of this is highly ritualized and systematized. This isn't smoking a little pot or taking some acid and going and watching Grateful Dead videos. This is a very elaborate ritual. Plus, he also says that before you do the ayahuasca, you have to do a fast. So you have to have a very specific diet for a set amount of time, sometimes several weeks. He also says that there are a lot of people, even masters of the use of ayahuasca, who do it for years and years and years without having any experience. And then suddenly, boom, it really happens. Remember, Michael Harner had that same experience when he had been taking ayahuasca, and he had the experience that caused him to create his system that he wrote about in The Way of the Shaman. He says even more so that by doing these practices, one develops a relationship with the plants, with the substance, with the world that creates the substance. The plants have obligations to you to create these experiences, but you create experiences with the plants. He goes on to describe himself training under these ayahuasca and medicine men of the era, medicine men and women for that matter, and having further visionary experiences that instruct him in the use of plants. But there are obligations to the specific plant and to the natural world. He says that when you experience creatures out there, they're very real. One of the most common experiences with ayahuasca is seeing everything as if it's a movie, but the movie's going on inside your head. He says that you encounter these entities and you develop relationships. You realize that all things are interconnected, and it is an experience of the natural world and the natural plants as sacred. But you're consuming the natural world to have an experience of the natural world that causes you to have a more powerful, interconnected understanding of the natural world. This isn't just like in modern science where you get a little dose of something, you take something, something happens. This is an ongoing process. The plant is nature, you consume the plant, and you experience the sacredness of nature. But we're built to have these experiences. The trigger can be something spontaneous, like you can have these powerful experiences. You can, like this was, sorry, I got ahead of myself in my lecture. So it's like the real world, it's a movie in your head. You experience interconnection with everything and interconnection with the substance you consume. But like I said, This is normal. This is natural. We human beings are built for this. One of the arguments is that the drugs don't create, the entheogens do not create the experience. They enable you to have the experience. Some people often say that after doing a lot of these entheogens, they start having the experiences on their own. Is this that they have brain damage, or is this that they have opened the doors of perception and now they can see things as they really are? We're built to have these experiences. The trigger can be something spontaneous, like Kripal and going to those Durga pujas and those Kali pujas, and then he has that experience at night. Or it can have some mild stimulation, like Grant Morrison. Now remember that Grant Morrison had just gone to a Buddhist temple right before that. Or they can be mediated by intense entheogens, like Beyer describes. You'll be able to watch a video about this in just a minute. So what I want to conclude with is, the plant and the experiences are sacred. All these experiences are direct experiences of a divine, of a sacred, and of a natural world. These are not experiences of connection while reading a sacred scripture or talking to a teacher, or you're with a whole bunch of people at a youth group singing, you have this experience of collective effervescence together, this collective joy that you feel. These are not supernatural. They are super natural. They're a natural super world. They're normal. We're wired for this. All these experiences and hierophanies can continue to occur. The sacred is there to be grasped. You don't necessarily need an entheogen. But what's clear is that if you are open, the sacred is not something from the past. It is something that you can experience at any time. And with that, the end and maybe a new beginning. Take care. Sorry, I'm having trouble here. But the meeting is over.